My name is Catherine McCary, and I'm the CEO of Disability in DC Metro. And this is the 8th annual Accessibility Forum from our organization. Today's topic, Adaptable Accessibility, incorporating evolving standards, requirements, and regulations into your digital accessibility program. Disability in DC Metro is the Disability in affiliate serving the National Capital Region, Washington, D.C., Virginia, and Maryland. And as a virtual organization, we also provide offerings to the country as a whole. We're a nonprofit business organization, and our mission is building the business-to-business network for disability inclusion. Today's webinar is sponsored and hosted by Level Access. Thank you so much for your support and your willingness to share your expertise with our audience today. And we're excited to meet our speakers. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce John Avila. John is the Chief Accessibility Officer for Level Access and a great friend. John, take us forward.
Great, thank you, Catherine. Welcome everybody to our roundtable discussion today on adaptable accessibility. We'll be talking about incorporating evolving accessibility standards, requirements, and regulations into your digital accessibility program. Let's cover the agenda. These are some of the topics we plan to discuss today. These include the legal landscape, the velocity of lawsuits, some high-profile cases, also talking about changing digital accessibility standards, what you need to know about those, and then how do you manage change? What are the best practices for managing change in regards to accessibility within your organization? The agile accessibility approach is one of the best approaches for addressing accessibility, and we'll talk about how to be agile and nimble. We'll also give some key takeaways, and we'll have time at the end for questions and answers as well. A little bit about Level Access. I'm the Chief Accessibility Officer at Level Access, been here for over 2 decades. What Level Access does is we help organizations of different sizes, both public sector and private sector, create accessible experiences, digital experiences for people with disabilities. We also help organizations meet their compliance requirements around digital accessibility requirements. Some of the ways we do this is through our platform, which is a managed service along with expert consultants and advice that is delivered through that platform. We cover different types of technology, including websites, mobile apps, documents, kiosks, game consoles, etc., and combine automated manual testing and other program level guidance to help you implement accessibility and iterate your accessibility over time. We have a number of great partners and companies that we work with, including Adobe, Samsung, Merck, Macy's, and Marriott. Let's jump into the legal landscape. In the US, the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, Title III applies to places of public accommodation. Currently, there are no technical requirements around digital accessibility in the ADA area. And so what this has meant is that there's a lot of lawsuits because there's not clear guidance on what technical requirements need to specifically be met to make sure that your services can be used by a person with a disability. So we have a chart here from Safe Bharat Shah, who has done some great research on tracking web accessibility lawsuits. And since this data was shown from 2017 to 2022, each year the number of suits has increased. And we expect this to continue as well into 2023. Now, overall, there has been some downward turn in ADA Title III suits, but those cover topics other than web accessibility. But in terms of web accessibility, the suits continue to climb year over year. And without any specific guidance on what is required specifically to be conformant, we expect this trend will continue. Now we're experiencing these suits all across different industries. So retail, things like e-commerce, hospitality, education, healthcare. No industry is immune. And so the industry as a whole has not really fully addressed accessibility. And so we're continuing to see these cases. Now, there are certain states where we find more cases are filed. New York is a good example where when more of these are filed, because the courts in that area are a little bit more sympathetic to the plaintiffs who may be filing these lawsuits. Next slide. Another thing that we're finding is the lawsuits, while we continue to experience them, they're not just being limited to websites. And because there are so many suits, they don't always make headlines. What we're finding is that it's not just web accessibility anymore, it's mobile accessibility is really important. So there's an increased number of things, suits around apps. We're also seeing things around virtual reality, any type of retail experience that may be selling physical things. Of course, there's a lot of changes in technology, and AI, artificial intelligence, is certainly one of those. So we have started to see some challenges around AI in hiring and the potential bias that can be there towards people with disabilities. Another thing that the pandemic taught us is that technology was moving towards self-service and kiosks, and allowing people to interact with devices in order to access food, other services, healthcare, to check in, to pay for things. And so we anticipate with future guidelines coming from the US Access Board related to self-service and kiosks that we will see more and more suits around this as well. Virtual reality continues to be a topic of much interest. And that is another area where we're starting to see some suits around that. Just because it's not a web experience doesn't mean it doesn't have to be made accessible to people with disabilities. So the future is bright. So in many ways, autonomous vehicles and technology changing is great because it will provide more access to people with disabilities. But at the same time, those technologies, when not designed to be inclusive of people with disabilities, will necessitate changes. And so we expect to see potential litigation in those areas. Next slide. So here are a few examples of some of the cases that we're experiencing. And I'm just going to quickly go through some of these before we get to our panel discussion. So sorry I didn't explain that earlier, but I'm just going to give an overview of some of the regulations and first, and then we'll get into our panel discussion with our great members in just one moment. So the first case, which is actually going to the Supreme Court, is Atchison Hotels versus Loeffler, and Loeffler was or is was a plaintiff, but filed suits against a number of organizations, including Atchison Hotels. And Loeffler is what is an accessibility tester. So this is a person who maybe doesn't intend to patronize a particular business, but instead looks at their website. In this case, she was looking at the websites to see if they contained accessibility information about hotel rooms, to see if the required disability-specific information was available on those sites. And then, so Atchison Hotels filed suit and basically said, you don't have authority to do that. You're just a tester. You're not actually planning to come to our hotels. So, so what happened is Atchison took this all the way up to the Supreme Court and said, do testers really have the ability to do this, or is this something that's unconstitutional? And the US Supreme Court said they wanted to hear the case. Loeffler said, "Can you please dismiss it? I don't want to, I don't want to dismiss. I want to dismiss my cases." But the Supreme Court said, "No, we want to actually consider this topic." They could still not hear it, but at this point, the Supreme Court is set to have initial arguments on this in October. So this is actually very useful because it will help us determine potentially whether testers can sue under the ADA, even if they don't intend to patronize the business. The second case of note was the Panara versus HTC. This is what I mentioned earlier in terms of virtual reality. There was a Viaport Infinity store where you could access materials like videos and virtual experiences. And the person wanted to make sure that these materials didn't have the captions necessary for them as a deaf person to access. And so the determination was that, yes, the ADA does apply in these situations, even though it's virtual reality content. And then the last example I wanted to mention was this Orozco versus Garland, which is a little bit different. This is a case related to Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. Section 508 is a federal executive branch requirement that the federal government in the US has to buy, procure, use, and maintain accessible technology that meets certain standards. And so when that technology is not accessible and the government doesn't meet those requirements, in addition to administrative action, people can sue to have injunctive relief to make the government address their Section 508 issues. So this case is just highlighting the fact that people can sue, employees with disabilities, the public, et cetera, can sue under Section 508 to get relief to make agencies address accessibility. So a lot of different things going on in different sectors. Next slide, please. Okay, so it's not just federal government, it's not just the ADA, right? Title III that applies to places of public accommodations. We're seeing a lot of activity in states as well. And so these are in particular state laws. So for example, we know that California has the Unruh Act, which is an anti-discrimination law. Building on that is a proposed bill, AB 1757, that we think likely will not get past this session because the session is ending soon in California, but it's likely to be brought up again. What this proposed bill would do would make, allow people with disabilities to say that a business, their website or mobile app wasn't accessible, it wasn't wasn't providing effective communication, and therefore they could sue for statutory damages and also attorney's fees to make that organization and the people who helped develop that organization's website to make it accessible. And so what's really unique here is that this proposed bill would not only just apply to the company that owns the website, but to the resource providers who actually built the website. And this is really a key difference because up until now, most lawsuits have not held developers, third-party vendors, these resource providers accountable for accessibility. So it's really been the companies, and the companies have to enforce that through their procurement, through contract language, essentially. But that hasn't been the case. So this is a novel idea, and so it's something that could gain traction. So this is something to keep a watch out for, and even if it doesn't pass this year, what happens next year as well. Also has a few interesting things in terms of requiring a certified person who is trained in accessibility do the certification that the website is accessible, and that's something novel as well. Historically, there hasn't been any requirements on the people who do auditing or assessments of a website to make sure that they are certified. In another state, Maryland, another bill that is enacted and is in effect with some deadlines already occurred and some coming soon, is around placing accessibility requirements for K through 12 education in terms of procurement of digital tools used in education. And this is really important because it helps apply procurement requirements to make sure that these digital tools meet the Section 508 standards in Maryland K-12. So typically, even if states have accessibility laws, say at the state level or higher education level, most of those state laws in the US don't apply to K-12. Now, the school systems have to meet the ADA, they have to meet Section 504 of the Rehab Act, but they don't necessarily have to have Section 508 compliant or conformant technology being used. They can meet the requirements through other means. And so this law changes that in Maryland and sets the bar much higher, which is very exciting. We're starting to see states adopt these laws because the federal laws were not strong enough. Similarly, in Colorado, which will take effect in 2024, is a bill that addresses accessibility in websites, mobile apps, hardware, et cetera, as well at the state level, but it also applies to public entities in Colorado, which means higher ed and state and local government, as including K through 12 education. So similar procurement requirements for WCAG conformance, that's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 AAA, and Section 508 as it would apply to hardware and other things. So a lot of state laws coming through, which leads me to the next thing I wanted to briefly talk about which is the proposed regulations for Title II of the ADA that were released last month. And they currently are in a comment period until early October. Title II of the ADA applies to state and local government in the US. And basically what the Department of Justice has done is said, we want to issue guidance setting a web accessibility standard for websites, for mobile apps, for state and local government. And that is being proposed at WCAG 2.1 A and AA. And it would have an effective date of between 2 and 3 years from once this rulemaking goes into effect. So it could be 2026, 2027 type range. What this would mean is that state and local governments, including K-12 education, higher ed, across the US would have to meet web accessibility requirements for mobile apps, for documentation, for websites. There are some exceptions around different things, such as password protected sites, but this is really a big, it's a big deal because one, it means that people with disabilities don't have to request accessibility as an afterthought, as an accommodation. It means that technology should just be used that is directly accessible, which allows people to not have to make special accommodation requests and so forth. So this is also going to create more consistency across the US states and local governments, which is a good thing, right? Because if you sell into higher ed or you sell into state and local governments, you want to know what the requirements are, the benchmarks are. You don't want to have different requirements in one state from another state. So this does provide some clarity to existing obligations under the ADA. Next, one of the things that has happened over the summer is the US government, Congress actually asked Department of Justice, OMB, General Services Administration to collect some information on the implementation of Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. And so that's what we talked about earlier in terms of the federal government buying, maintaining, and using accessible technology. What Congress found is that the implementation of 508 was inconsistent across the government. Some agencies were doing great, some agencies were not doing it so great. And so they requested different assessment criteria, and this is going to be an annual reporting requirement. And then we expect that information will be reported to Congress at the end of the year, and we will have more insight on how Section 508 is being implemented throughout the US government. In other related US government news, Department of Education and DOJ, Office of Civil Rights, have made a few different statements around accessibility in higher education, including the desire to update Section 504 regulations to make it more clear on what is required under Section 504 for accessibility. The Department of Education OCR office, they've done over 50 different decrees in the past year. And what they are telling higher education is you really need to set accessibility standards. You need to buy things, make things that are accessible. You need to remediate things that are not accessible. And you need to allow people with disabilities to provide feedback. Those are really critical things. Now, I think the ADA proposed regulations will help with that as well, to provide clarity for those groups. Lastly, internationally, there's a few different things. We have the Accessible Canada Act. That is, some of those deadlines are enforced, some are coming depending on the size of the entity. Basically what that means in Canada, if you are a federally regulated business, like banking, if you're a federal government, a tribal government, you rail, other transportation, you have to meet these requirements, which include providing an accessibility plan and taking feedback from people with disabilities and considering accessibility in many different areas, including communication and information communication technology like websites. Right now, it doesn't set specific web accessibility standards, but it does call on Standards Canada to create accessibility standards. So those standards may be forthcoming. And then lastly, the European Accessibility Act, not in effect yet, but the law has been passed by each member nation of the EU. It goes into effect in June. And really the big thing about this is applies to goods and services. So it requires computers and technology and things like that to be accessible to people with disabilities, and services such as e-commerce, banking, and other types of services have to meet accessibility requirements as well across the EU. And so this will affect the private sector of people who are providing e-commerce and selling information technology in the EU will have to meet these requirements. These requirements will fall on the existing requirements most likely. That's EN 301, 549, and 2 other standards. So that will be the sort of, that's the equivalent to Section 508, essentially in the EU, is that European standard. So that's what will be used in some way to measure, to know you have met the EU requirements. Next slide. And I promise I'm getting very close to being done with this. And then we can move to our panel discussion. WCAG 2.2, you're probably all wondering, where is it? Is it out yet? I haven't heard. So WCAG 2.2, we've all been expecting this for a long time. There are 9 new success criteria, 6 at A and AA. It builds on WCAG 2.1. The latest news is that it's expected in September or later, but it will be this year, 2023. There was some last minute objections, but those things are being worked around. There won't be expected any additional changes. Most of them should be just editorial and understanding, interpretation, but we are expecting that in September. The one thing that WCAG 2.2 does is it does part of it, it will be backwards compatible, but it does remove one of the requirements, which is 411, which is for parsing content. It's a sort of an outdated requirement. And to be backwards compatible, the W3C is also planning to say that that requirement can be considered met backwards compatible for 2.0 and 2.1. So that requirement may be able to be dropped, which is the first time that any of the WCAG requirements have been either removed or deemed not necessary anymore because they're no longer relevant. So that's interesting. One less thing to test, right? And then another thing that the Web Accessibility Initiative of the W3C is working on as well is this WCAG to non-web ICT. Now, ICT is just information and communication technology. So what this document does is it helps you understand how to apply the WCAG standards, which are written for web, how to apply that to non-web things like mobile apps or software or documents. Now, it doesn't provide additional guidance on mobile apps. It's not what it's intended for, but it does provide some additional guidance on how to interpret the standards. What do they apply? How do they apply? So it's very useful. Why this is useful is other standards, other regulations like Section 508, like the European standard, will look to this for guidance on how to apply WCAG outside of web content. And then lastly, WCAG 3.0 is expected 2026 plus. That will be a completely new standard with a new conformance model. It will try to take into account that the fact that most websites today are complex, they're dynamic, they're constantly changing, and 100% conformance to the standards all the time may not be practical. And so we hope to address some of those complex problems in WCAG 3.0. Next slide. Okay, great. Now is the opportunity we can move to our roundtable discussion. I want to introduce our moderator, Eduardo Meza Etienne. Eduardo is the principal accessibility subject matter expert at Level Access and also is the Chief Accessibility Officer at Disability in DC Metro. Take it away, Eduardo.
Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate it. Great information, and I'm really excited to be here and moderate this amazing roundtable. We're really lucky to be able to listen to these expert panelists where they'll be able to share some of the best practices across their organizations. And obviously we have different industries. So again, a wealth of information. But before we get started, I would really like to introduce each one of them. So let me get started first with Kate Sweeney. Kate, thank you for being here. She is the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, Digital Accessibility Program Director, where she provides leadership and oversight of the department's Section 508 program in support of the department's mission and to ensure federal employees and consumers of HHS information with disabilities have equal access to information and communication technology. Kate oversees the development of departmental policies, process, and procedures, providing guidance and support to IT project teams on the application of Section 508 requirements, managing the department's Section 508 program budget, and conducting process improvement activities to provide better services and resources to HHS employees. She brings over 10 years expertise in policy, IT program and project management, and process improvement solutions to HHS. She has extensive experience in facilitating and managing cross-functional process improvement activities and has served in a broad range of roles, including document specialists, facilitation and logistics analysts, IT specialists, and management and program analysts. She graduated with a Bachelor's of Science degree from the University of Wisconsin-Stout with a concentration in quality and industrial management. She stays connected with the academic community by engaging in the Department of State's virtual student internship program and mentoring virtual students pursuing undergraduate and graduate degrees. Kate, thank you for being here. We really appreciate you. Next, we have Chas Steinmetz, who is the Senior Vice President of Digital Accessibility at PNC, where he is responsible for creating the technology, governance, and culture at PNC that promotes digital experiences accessible to all. This includes assistive technology, accessibility testing tools, governance frameworks, coaching, and education. Chas, thank you for being here as well. Next, I would like to introduce Guatam Rao, who is EY's Global Digital Accessibility Leader and responsible for the firm's accessibility strategy, including policy, methodology, procurement, awareness, and training. He's a certified expert by the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, certified CPWA, professional in web accessibility with 20 plus years in product development, UX design, usability, and accessibility. He established and currently leads the EY Accessibility Center of Excellence, providing accessibility services for both internal and external clients. He also collaborates with enterprise functions, including technology, procurement, marketing communications, talent, DEI, learning, and legal to drive accessibility adoption across the firm. He's an active member of EY's Disability Employee Group, and is responsible for raising accessibility awareness across the organization. Thank you, Guatam, for being here. And last but not least, John, I need to formally introduce you. You've already mentioned he is the Chief Accessibility Officer at Level Access with 20 plus years working for the company, an active member of the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, also a certified professional in web accessibility by the IAAP. And he's the one at Level Access who really guides digital accessibility, implementation, knowledge transfer, and solutions across the organization and to some of our clients, Fortune 500 organizations, US federal government, and educational organizations. Again, thank you all for being here. We really appreciate you taking the time. So now let's turn our panel to talk about how these updates that you mentioned, John, impact some of the programs. And I'd like to get started with you, Kate, if you don't mind. So as an accessibility champion in the US federal government, public sector, obviously, broadly speaking, and based off of John's overview, what are you monitoring closely these days?
So thank you so much for having me today, and thank you all for joining. This is a great opportunity to stay engaged. I love these questions coming in. But why is this important to us? Especially at Department of Health and Human Services, we do business all over the world, in other countries. We do business at the state, local level, tribal levels, in academia. We have grants, we work across the board. And so whenever accessibility is enhanced in one area, one state, one level, one country, is very important for us to stay connected so we can continue growing, so we can continue staying connected. And we can continue leveraging lessons learned from other people, so we don't always have to be the ones learning from our lessons, although we do that quite often. But it is very important to stay connected. It's very important for us to continue growing, not just for our employees, but like I said, for all of the customers that require information, that go to HHS for help, that want to go to HHS for help, that need to, that have a desire to, that think they want to, anything. We want to make sure that we're providing that great customer experience, that great employee experience. And the only way we can do that is to continue driving our accessibility programs, staying on top of these enhancements, making sure that we can do everything that we can to incorporate them into our agency. The federal government is not really known for changing quickly or often. So we want to make sure that we can leverage these wins and we can leverage what others are doing so that we can continue building our case, we can continue driving forward, and we can continue being a leader in accessibility.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kate. I appreciate that. Guatam, let me turn our attention to you. Obviously, EY having presence in many different countries. How do you keep up with the ever-changing regulations and standards?
Yeah, thanks all for having me. So I think as a global firm, so we are seeing some trends in terms of accessibility. First is, it's really getting elevated at C-suite level across different enterprise functions. So we see not just the CIOs and CTOs in technology being interested, but also, branding people. Sometimes it's the risk, sometimes it's, compliance people, talent, DEI. So there's a lot of overlap and a lot of interest, and we're seeing this across the globe, right? So obviously US is in some way seen as a leader because ADA has been there for long. But, with the EU Accessibility Act, we're seeing a lot of interest from the EMEA region, and then Canada as well is generating a lot of interest and work and opportunities. In terms of regulation, I would say it kind of breaks down into the web and then the non-web, and then the non-digital, right? So for web, the good thing is you just double down on WCAG 2.2, right? So we're already preparing our people to kind of get ready for that and getting ready for the policy. And like John nicely mentioned, WCAG does have some non-web guidance for software and documentation and that kind of stuff, and we're seeing some volume of work for that as well. But then the EU directive actually goes beyond, right? So it goes into ticketing systems and telephony and office equipment and all that. So for that, there's no real standard, but I think there's some general guidance, and we'll see that kind of evolving over the years. But that's something that we all need to keep look out for in terms of best practices. So in short, kind of double down WCAG for now, but keep your eye out in the future for these other things.
Fantastic. Thank you, Guatam. I'd like to ask a question to Chas at PNC. Obviously, PNC, financial services institution based here in the US, highly regulated industry. Can you share your thoughts around how you're tracking as well, any legal changes or technical changes, and how you incorporate those into your accessibility program as well?
Happy to. Yeah. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. I think we've all been there. I think at some point in our journey where we're embracing accessibility and WCAG and different standards across the globe starts very grassroots, or maybe within a pocket of your organization. And so, something I'm very mindful of, and I would encourage others to do, is you really have to. The standards are always going to change, right? And usually for the good. You have to look at your program as a machine that can drive an outcome against whatever the standard may be that you're targeting at that moment, right? So thinking through, a lot of this is technology, but it's an organization as a whole thinking about your vendor management processes, how you bring vendors into the organization. Are you making sure that your contracts, your RFPs, the way you vet these vendors and partners of yours are providing you an accessible product? As you think about how you deliver, a digital product, whether it's a website or something of the sorts, think about vulnerabilities. I compare, at least when you're building the machine, if you will, very common to how we think about security and the vulnerabilities associated with our products, right? Like if you're a software engineer or you're somewhere along that pipeline, this, right? Like there are checks and balances in place to make sure you are delivering a quality product that's secure, protects your customer. You got to think about accessibility the same way, right? So how do you inject? I kind of think of it almost like how do you build this into law, the DNA of your organization? How do you build the checks and balances, just like you would for something like security, into your product lifecycle? So that way, no one team is going to conquer the world, boil the ocean, and make everything accessible, right? So you have to be able to, multiply yourself and do so by injecting accessibility into your standard business practices so that you're driving towards that outcome. So whether it's 2.0, 2.1, 2.2, 3 WCAG standards, right? You can just kind of change the standard across the machine you've built, and organically you're going to start moving in the right direction. On top of that, I think you have to make sure you're aware of, is what I built working, right? So looking at another recommendation is I love the kind of the scanning tools that exist out there for accessibility, those top-down scanning tools, not because they're perfect, but because they give you that barometer, that kind of pulse on your organization and how you're doing, and if you're moving in the right direction or regressing in different ways.
Great answers. Thank you. Thank you, Chas. This is extremely useful, especially for our audience. And I have a little message from the ASL interpreters to our panelists. If we could please slow down a little bit, because we want to make sure that they keep up with the ASL interpreting. I really appreciate it. Chas, you mentioned WCAG 2.2, and I'd like to actually turn my question to John. Obviously, he's one of the members of the accessibility guidelines at the W3C. John, from your perspective and based on your experience, do you think that teams within organizations need to immediately incorporate this new success criteria that you talked about?
So many of the 2.2 criteria are best addressed during the design of products and services. There are things like around authentication, and when you fill out forms, not having to re-enter information over and over again, or placing help in consistent locations. So these are things that are not necessarily just addressed by a developer in the code. They're actually things that need to be considered when you're building something. So my recommendation and the W3C's recommendation is to use the most recent version of the standard. So when 2.2 is final, to aim for that. You'll be backwards compatible with older versions, but definitely try to address your new content you're building to meet the requirements. Some states tend to want to aim towards the current standard, so they might say follow the latest version of WCAG rather than having a specific version. So there may be some instances where you may be required to meet 2.2 because it will be the current version. But in many cases, may still be on 2.1, or for example, in Section 508 and in other states in the US, it may still be on 2.0. But keep in mind that these standards are just the minimum for accessibility. And so there's a lot more that can be done to make the experience better for your customers.
Thank you, John. Definitely, that's a great answer and recommendation, of course. I'm curious from a public sector, obviously, you said it earlier, Kate, it can take some time for the government to actually embrace. So how is WCAG 2.2 impacting your program? And as you procure new ICT, are you requiring 2.2 conformance? Can you share a little bit about that with us?
Yes. It's a journey for sure. We, as Jonathan was saying, a lot of times the default is to go to the minimum. What is the least that I have to do right now? And then when we try to educate our customers on maybe we should be more than a D student, maybe we should try for that B or that A, not saying we have to be on the honor roll, but let's just try a little bit harder. It can become overwhelming. And so what we're really doing at this time is taking a step back and reevaluating our communication strategy, our communication plan, as well as our training plan. We really want to make sure that as we start giving these recommendations to be more accessible, and in my opinion, it's where you should be. It shouldn't be more accessible, less accessible. We should be doing the best we can in every situation. However, making sure that we're educating our customers in what that entails and making sure we're educating in a way that's understandable and relatable. I remember when I first started in accessibility and I got my first checklist back, I was like, abort mission, this is too hard. I don't know what I'm doing. And throughout the years, I've been able to learn, and I want my customers to be able to have that same experience that I did. Once it clicks, it clicks. So we're really taking this opportunity. We're really taking this moment where these standards are being enhanced and improving accessibility, that we're really engaging that in our communication. It's not just me sending a VPAP back and say, no, I don't like this, but really making sure our PMs, our cores, our project teams, that they are able to receive this information, understand why I would say something appears sketchy, why something should be indicated at a higher level of accessibility. Make sure that they are empowered to make those decisions and those recommendations. And it's not always Kate talking at you. So hopefully I answered your question, but yes, we really are using this opportunity to re-engage that communication, to reinvigorate the accessibility programs, to put it on the forefront, to engage our stakeholders and continue moving forward, because that's what we're here to do.
Absolutely, Kate. Thank you. I think you touched on a couple of things that really stood out for me, which is educating. And that's an important role, obviously. And there's another one that popped up in my mind, which is, progress over perfection. We want to make sure that we keep moving in the right direction as new standards come out. as well. So thank you for that. I'd like to ask Guatam and Chas if there is anything that you would like to add from your perspective in the private sector as far as new technical standards and a detailed accessibility program.
Well, we're chomping on the bit to get to 2.2. So our policy actually is at 2.1 now. So the minute this becomes official, we're going to bump that up. But we've actually already integrated that into our training program. So every developer designer is already getting up to speed on that. And I really feel, like John said, that these changes, even though they're few in number, are very meaningful. Having help in a consistent location or accessible authentication. That we feel that's a really big thing because you're blocking a person, right? So if you use CAPTCHA or reCAPTCHA, people can't solve the puzzle, they can't get in. So, in the past, we used to complain that it's a poor user experience, but now it'll be a standard that nobody can kind of complain about. So I'm really looking forward to this, and we're gearing up for it.
Thank you.
I'll add my honest view of this. We obviously are watching closely to, and we are going to adopt it as quick as we reasonably can. But what's more important to me, we're a few years into building this program, that machine I referred to earlier, and what's important to me, more important than chasing the latest standard, not that it's not important, is making sure that I have a foundation that works, right? And if I get into trying to change standards until I'm confident that I have something that works, it all falls apart, right? And so I just want other people who maybe are kind of in a similar position to where you got a program, but like you're not where you want to be yet, trying to pull the rug out from underneath you, right? In the middle of building something can be tough. So I think, yes, new standards are important. We need to embrace them as quickly as we can, but I think you have to reflect on where you are in your journey and don't get distracted by the new shiny. You need to make sure you have something really solid that you can then build off. Otherwise, you're always going to be in this kind of waterfall chasing your tail kind of approach.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chas. Appreciate your answer. And we always, especially in large organizations, sometimes there are challenges as well when it comes to building up that accessibility program internally. So I would like to ask all of you in the panel if you can give some advice to other internal champions when you're trying to build up that accessibility program. How does one advocate for budget, for instance, if they don't have it already? That's always a challenge. So I'd like to hear from you if you've faced those challenges, if you have any recommendations or best practices that you can share with our audience. Anyone?
I'd be happy to jump in.
Yes, Kate.
Especially around budget, because the federal government is not known for spending a lot of money, especially in the accessibility area in the way that it needs to be. We have been very successful recently in negotiating budget, in creating partnerships that does bring in a little bit more of a budget, but it's very daunting, especially when you're requesting money from individuals that might not be fully aware of the scope of an accessibility program, as well as where they really stand in accessibility. And so we found really early on that we could ask for as much money as we wanted, but if leadership didn't understand why we needed this money, why we've gone this long without money, and they're just hearing about it, it was a long road to get to a point of educating our leadership to really be able to fully understand the scope of accessibility. It's not just, did you procure the right, most accessible platform? It's every module that you build off of that platform. It's every knowledge article that you post to that platform. It's every meeting minutes document for executive meetings. It's anything that could be FOIA'd, which is basically all of our documents. And so we really had to make sure that we collected the data and then we communicated that data to leadership in a way that resonated with them. So exactly to your point, one of the first things we did was find partnerships. Who has required training? Who's already tracking material that's required by the department? Who has not necessarily a large budget, but who has money that they're using to develop content? And so how can we start leveraging these partnerships and these stakeholders so that they can bring us along their journey, and then they can start talking about how great their final product was because they included accessibility throughout their journey. And so once we started getting these partnerships and getting these wins with outside groups, outside stakeholders, and those stakeholders started communicating that benefit to our leadership, and we continued our education pitch, then leadership started to understand, wow, we really do need to shift some investment to better understand and continue growing. I don't think that, I mean, I'm not sure if any accessibility program really ever feels like they have enough money, right? We always want more money. There's always things to do. There's always things we want to try. There's always things that we want to engage with. But really just understanding what you can do with what you have and leveraging those partnerships where you can has been instrumental and paramount to our growth.
Thanks, Kate, for sharing your journey. That's interesting. I'd like to hear from the private sector, if you don't mind, either Guatam or Chas, please.
Yeah, I mean, I can add our experience, right? So I think many start off in this field as a kind of a lone wolf or an individual contributor. I know it gets to be hard, but when I did this, you have to put on your marketing or your sales hat, right? So finding a champion who will or sponsor your initiative is important, right? So, and it has to be a leader. Usually you will find people who are passionate about it, but then you have to make the business case, right? So that is the marketing or the sales expert, why we do it, good for business, risk, brand, better product, all that stuff. So having that material ready to, give it to whoever and whenever is important. The other is the notion of starting small, right? You don't have to have, boil the ocean. You just pick a project, get going, get some lessons, or, any MVP mode, right? And then apply that rule book or playbook to other things, right? And then once you get to a certain place, what we call internally is 3 E's, right? So educate, elevate, embed. So you have to always be an educator. You will become a teacher at different levels, right? So, and then elevate is you have to elevate it to a standard or a policy. It's not just a guideline, do your best. It has to be elevated and then embedded in the processes so that everybody knows what to do. A designer at the design stage, a developer, and then a tester and release. So those are the 3 E's we follow.
Let's go, Tom. Appreciate that. Chas, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, Guatam, I really like what you mentioned around all the different reasons you would go on this journey, right? There's, of course, it's the right thing to do, but there's the customer retention attraction part of it. There's the workforce and talent piece of it, and who you want to be attracting from a talent perspective. There's the risk component. I think you have to kind of look into who are you as a company, right? What is important to your leadership? If you're a bank, maybe you're a little more risk adverse, right? And so you often take that lens. Maybe you're a software company and you're thinking about user experience and innovation, right? So I think all those things that Guatam rightly mentioned should be part of that business value statement, but prioritize them based upon what you think is important to your organization and your leaders. And another tip I would offer is if you're in a medium or large size company, you often have employee resource groups. There's different groups for different things out there, and there very well may be one for disability, right? And a lot of times those groups have executive sponsors tied to them. That could be a good in or place to start. Regardless if there's an executive sponsor, right, there is a primed group of advocates that have your back that represent and sit across the whole company, right? So when you're starting out and you're looking for feedback, looking for support, that's often a good place to look as well.
Amazing, great ideas and best practices. I appreciate you sharing all this. At this point, I'd like to really turn our attention to Section 508, reporting requirements and the impact to government contractors. And Kate, I'd like to ask you specifically, obviously the DOJ has ramped up these reporting requirements with a very lengthy questionnaire. So I'm wondering, how did HHS approach answering those questions? And if you could share some of the challenges along the way with us.
Absolutely. And I tell everybody, you're never going to meet somebody more of a fan of that questionnaire than me. I absolutely love it. I would have appreciated a little bit more time to gather that amount of data, but I think it's an excellent reporting tool. I think the categories that were identified really honed in on that communication piece between accessibility programs and their leadership. It's terms that leadership understands, your IT systems. Where do you land? What's your budget? Your websites? It's not too technical, but it also incorporates things that are just a necessity. Your time and attendance systems, training, where do you stand in these areas? So when the questionnaire came in, I was expecting 40 questions and received 105, which was a little bit of a sticker shock. But as I said, you're never going to meet anybody that is more of a fan of that questionnaire than myself. But the first thing we did was just dissect the questions. How are we going to respond? What are questions that are going to be pretty much repeated until we make some major cultural changes here? And where are some questions that are really done more on our component level, that they maybe have a little bit of a different answer than the department level? Where do we really need to start gathering this data? But also, what additional stakeholders do we need to start reaching out to that maybe we weren't reaching out to on a regular basis? We knew who they were. We've exchanged pleasantries, but we really haven't stayed connected in a way that we would be expected to provide these answers on an annual basis. And so we broke down the questions. We also created different collection mechanisms, because that's the other part to it. I can answer for the department, but we have to go to the component level now, which to me is one of my favorite things about this questionnaire, because I think I'm doing great, but is my information really getting down to the components? And then from there, are they able to get the information down to their component levels? Does everybody understand the services that we provide at the departmental level and how that trickles down? Do some component levels have stricter policies, as we talked about earlier? Are you just the DC student, or is your component level requiring a higher level of conformance based off of your customers and your stakeholders? So we really needed to break down this questionnaire, but we also needed to be able to give leadership some positive notes. We needed to be able to make sure that they understood, by making certain decisions at their level, they have a huge influence on our ability to continue growth and continue our scores. It's not just about, did I get the highest score that I can select, but are we, as Chas was saying earlier, are we really having that machine that is going to be sustainable, that we're really answering these questions in a way that it's part of our culture now? And are we putting things in place it's going to be a part of our culture in the future? And so, although very lengthy, did require a few hours on my vacation time to submit, I think it was well worth it. And I am so excited of what's going to be published, because it gives us an opportunity to engage on deeper levels. I think that here GSA does a great job of bringing agencies together for open conversations, but now we can really target where other agencies similar to us are doing really well, or maybe we're doing really well, we can share information. So it really takes all of that communication down to a level that we can really drive it at better solutions for our program and really increase our maturity.
Thank you, Kate. I mean, obviously, accessibility touches so many areas that sometimes we're not even aware of. So thank you for sharing your experience with this. And John, I'd like to ask you, obviously the deadline to submit the answers has recently passed. So what happens now? What's next?
Right, they'll be compiling these answers together of different agencies, and then that will then be reported to Congress, and we should know more what that report looks like. There have been in the past some reports that were done, and there was a long period of time when there was not a biennial report that was completed. So this really starts to make sure that there's not a gap in implementation, and so it's really about getting a pulse on across the government, how things are being done. The idea is that if they have this information, they can provide the right training, the right guidance to agencies. It's not, so much meant to, go after agencies, but to support them. Where do they need support? A lot of the questions that were asked were around maturity of the programs. So the bulk of the questions were around accessibility maturity.
Thank you, John. And I'd like to stay with you for a second. Any other updates expected regarding government accessibility at the U.S. federal level that you can share with us?
Right. Yeah, I mentioned a few things like potential guidelines coming out for kiosks and self-service. There have been other guidelines related to like health diagnostic medical equipment, things like that from the U.S. Access Board. The Access Board continues to put out some great informative advice. Sometimes those guidelines get included in regulations, and sometimes they don't, and they're just provided as guidelines and not required. But I anticipate that while some agencies will want to go further than WCAG 2.0, that likely 2.2 would not be adopted by the U.S. government, but we'll see how that turns out. I think there's certainly a lot of work that can be done, even within the current guidelines at the U.S. Government level. There's certainly a lot of progress that can be made in terms of accessibility within there across agencies. And whether that's social media presence, there are also some other accessibility guidelines that are required, such as use of plain language, as an example. So there can be some accessibility benefit from other requirements that the U.S. government has. In particular, I think plain language will help people with cognitive disabilities, people who are neurodiverse, access government services, and a lot of these things will make it more usable by everyone.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that. I would now like to turn our attention to Guatam and Chas, starting with you, Guatam. Obviously, there is not good information out there and clarity around the American with Disabilities Act and how it applies to data accessibility for the private sector. So would you welcome some clarity around that? Because obviously that's why we have so many lawsuits. Any thoughts around that specific topic, Guatam?
Yeah, I mean, clarity always would help, but I mean, we assume that WCAG is the barometer by which you measure, and we are seeing that even outside in EMEA as well, right? So yeah, so anything that DOJ can help in enforcing that or clarifying that. I know they have sent some various communications over the years, but again, it's not been very consistent. So yeah, I mean, definitely we would like that. But whenever our clients which are in the regulated industries come to us, they say, let's do ADA testing. They don't even say, let's do accessibility testing. So no, it's not, it's accessibility testing. But so yeah, so they equate, and we kind of have equated there too. Yeah.
Thank you. Chas, anything to add?
Yes, clearly, yes. I think, going back to our conversation around getting, leader budgets and senior leadership buy-in and things like that, when you're not operating in a gray area of, is this required or not? And it is just required and it's written down clearly somewhere, I think, in a very binary sense, it just makes that argument that much easier to get your program off the ground and get moving, right? So yes.
Thanks very much. I concur with all of you. Now, let me turn a little bit our topic to agile accessibility. I know that at Level Access, John, we talk about the importance of agile accessibility and incorporating accessibility into the beginning of the development life cycle. And it's so important. Not only that, but also, John, you mentioned that the new updates to 2.2 actually impact that very beginning of the process. So can you tell us a little bit more about the agile approach to accessibility and why it is recommended?
Yeah, absolutely. It's good question. So historically, when people have thought about accessibility, sort of, the QA phase, and for years we've been pushing, say, let's address accessibility at the design phase and the design systems during development, et cetera. But it's beyond that. In terms of like when accessibility audits are done, historically, some accessibility companies have produced this massive audit of results in Excel sheets and things like that. And then people have to work through addressing all those issues and getting them all queued up. And so even if a team is working in an agile fashion, like a development team, the accessibility process that organizations were using was still very much waterfall, sort of very much this, we'll do this gigantic audit and then we'll re-audit and then we'll re-audit, and there's all these issues. And that is not really effective because what we find is that it's best to address accessibility in different chunks. So the way, if you look at how things are created, there's common components within systems. Not all aspects of a system are equally important in terms of access. And so looking at the priority areas, targeting those areas for accessibility, getting those quick wins, getting accessibility into earlier, but getting it into fix things without having hundreds of issues to worry about is a great way to get embedded in teams, get some good wins, get people excited about accessibility, and then continue to work on those issues. I think sometimes people can be scared about accessibility because it does seem daunting and it can be complex, but there's lots of things that you can do to get started, to get slowly get each team building things in accessibility. For example, maybe your developers aren't ready to do some of this manual testing, but there's things that the developers can do during development in terms of using automated tools, having accessibility checks in their continuous integration and development cycles, things like that, that start to move accessibility forward slowly to make progress. And then over time, you can address accessibility more completely. It does take several years for organizations to really achieve accessibility in a very mature fashion. So it is something that works, that does require time to get right. But accessibility also is not something that you can just get to a point and then feel comfortable with. You always have to keep iterating. There's always going to be new standards. There's going to be technology is going to evolve, and you always need to refine your process and rethink your process.
Thank you, John. I appreciate your answer. Now, Kate, I believe you're all an agile shop when it comes to product development. And obviously, agile accessibility borrows from many of these same principles. So I'd like to hear your thoughts around agile accessibility, some of the benefits of doing work this way that you can share with us and the audience.
Yes, I actually love the agile methodology. I practice it anywhere I can. And one of the things that I really like about it is because it gets your mind thinking from the customer perspective, the users. I can think something is fantastic, and I can think that I'm doing a very great job. But if it doesn't resonate with my customers and my users, how great of a job did I really do? And so I really like being able to leverage that part of the conversation with these agile teams. It translates that accessibility technical standard to a way that the program and team and developers can understand what is the final impact, what are we doing, what is the experience. Now, when they're coming to the agile team, to the sprint team, their minds are already thinking in that manner. So being able to translate these technical standards to those real life situations really helps them focus as they go through their sprints, as they do their continuous development, as they refine their backlog. And most importantly, my favorite is the retrospective, because anything that I can take from this team and engage another team, maybe they're using a similar platform, but they're building a different module and have a different customer base, but I can learn from our experience in the development process. It really benefits me. It creates value in my program to be able to share that information and provide that information across the board to our customers. So I am a huge fan of lots of things, GSA questionnaires and agile, but it really does get your mindset out of these more technical standards and into a solution.
Excellent, Kate. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, again, as we are following this, I see a little pattern here. We start with public sector, then we switch to private sector. Chas, I'd like to hear your thoughts from your experience and if you're actually implementing agile accessibility on your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm also mindful of, even though we're mostly agile across our crews, we still have plenty of waterfall things in there. It happens, right? And so when I think about how you approach this, right? Like, I think when you look at like new applications, brand new things you're building, I think it's a much easier battle when you say, hey, we're drawing a line in the sand. Anything net new coming into the organization needs to be accessible, and you have a lot more leverage and opportunity to do that with new things. It's the existing stuff you have, that mountain of things that you have, that is the tough thing, right? And I think whether you're agile or waterfall, I think a great, what's worked for us is looking at how you deploy change, right? Think about, you have your consumer facing website, right? It's not like you go in there once a year and you update every single page. No, whether it's waterfall or agile, forget that for the moment. You are iterating upon that page, right? Like a new page for a new product, or you're updating the text on this thing. And so a way to find success is looking at how your teams deploy change, release management, change management, and inject accessibility into that. So when your team, when you have a development team out there and they're going to go add a button to a website, I don't know, right? You say, hey, whatever's in scope of that release, that button needs to be accessible. And so for most things that your customers, or the important things, right, those things are changing pretty frequently. And so if you can just say any changes to these pages have to be accessible, over the course of months and years, as your development teams touch different parts of that web page, you're remediating, right? You're fixing all the issues, because accessibility is supposed to be a good thing, right? And you want it to be, you have to be mindful of kind of how people are viewing your program. And if you're the team that comes in with, hey, we just audited your website and here's the 4,000 issue report in the Excel spreadsheet that John mentioned, nobody's going to like you, and it's going to tarnish what should be a very positive and easy to get behind program. So if you look at it from a agile, iterative kind of way of implementing, I think it's much easier to find success and show progress, more importantly.
Thank you, Chas. And Guatam, let's hear from you, please.
Yeah, so I think we're all in agreement. Agile is kind of a win-win. It comes out faster, cheaper. You build it right, build it accessibly. So yeah, so we baked accessibility into our methodology. And so a large component is training, making sure people are trained, know what to do. And for our larger enterprise projects, we actually have dedicated accessibility SMEs from my team, which sit in them, so that they're, even though their other professionals are trained, making sure the visual designs are accessible, writing, accessibility requirements in user stories, testing within each sprint, and then for every program increment, doing a larger audit. So just, and also using that metric or metrics and reporting to kind of show, look, last year we did this large audit and you took on this debt and, you struggled to fix it, but look, we're doing it this way. It's, it's much cheaper and faster. So it's, yeah, it's pretty clear that's the way to go.
Excellent, excellent. Well, a lot of great information shared here during the panel, but in the interest of time, we're gonna have to wrap it up. There's going to be some time for Q&As. I see a lot of questions in the Q&A chat that will be addressed momentarily. But any parting thoughts very quickly from each one of the panelists, please. I'm going to start off with you, Kate, please.
Thank you. My parting advice would be take this moment when accessibility is really at the forefront and leverage that in refining your communications, identifying your stakeholders, identifying your champions, and really hone in on making that message relevant to everyone. As it was stated earlier, as long as there's a requirement around it, makes it easier to communicate. I thought this was going to be the easiest job in the world by just saying it's the law, you have to do it. I was very wrong. It can be very challenging, but that's why you have these great accessibility forums and communities that you can come together and you can draw on each other's experience. So I would continue building your stakeholder groups and your communications and really, as I do, borrow from other people. I don't have the time to do it all myself. And so learning from others and borrowing is the best approach.
Thank you, Kate. John, would you mind sharing your thoughts, please?
Yeah, the one thing that comes to mind is that accessibility is really something that's part of inclusive design. Accessibility is the outcome. It's something that there isn't a one button fix. We continue to see customers who look at solutions like overlay solutions that claim to fix your site in one line of code. Those almost certainly don't work. They create a less accessible experience and they don't protect you from lawsuits. So I would just say, accessibility does need to be done right. It doesn't have to be done all at once, but be wary of these, people who can say you can fix it with one line of code.
Thank you, John. Next, Chas, please.
Sure. Guatam, I correct me. The 3 E's you mentioned, I really liked. Was it educate, engage? What were they again?
Educate, elevate, embed.
Perfect. I really like that, especially the education part of it, right? Because as you're starting out, like if you just try to jam these things in, right, and you don't have a culture, education built up across your organization, people aren't going to be connected to your mission, and you can't solve it by yourself, right? You need people rallying behind you, people who are tied to accessibility and disability for whatever reasons in their lives. You want those people on your side. You want that team behind you. So education really helps start. And then I would say, secondly, iterate, right? Focus on small wins and building, right? Because you want to be able to to measure and show progress, maybe in small but meaningful ways to start. You can use that as leverage for more budgets, more support, the things you need, right? But you can't just disappear for 2 years to go build some magical program, right? Like you have to be able to show progress. So focusing small and building from there, I think is really important.
Amazing. Thank you, Chas. Last, Guatam, please.
Yeah, so I think I'm aligned with everybody. So I think you need to be strategic. Many people in this field are kind of very passionate and they give purpose to their field. So don't give up on that. I think you definitely will make an impact. Have a long-term vision, which is ambitious, but also be tactical and make sure you take incremental steps towards and measurable steps towards improving, so that you can keep going.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to thank the panelists. You're still not off the hook yet. We still have our Q&A, so please sit tight. If we could actually bring up the contact information slide. Actually, well, we're going to be talking about the practical takeaways from this session. I actually asked our panelists to share some of these practical takeaways. I think the first one came from you, Guatam, which is educate yourself about, again, educate, very important, again, shared by both you and Chas. Educate yourself about evolving standards and regulations. Subscribe to newsletters from organizations like the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, Disability in DC Metro, which is hosting this event together with Level Access, and any other organization, like-minded organization. The second one is, I don't know if this one came from you, Kate. Small steps can lead to big programmatic wins. I'm guessing, was it you? Anyways,
no, but I'll take credit for it. It's
okay.
Good.
No problem. I just saw a K in there. Anyways, the third one is understanding the evolving space will help shift your. Let me minimize this. Understanding the evolving space will help shift your approach from reactive to proactive. I think this is an important one, definitely. Rather be reactive, proactive than reactive, definitely. The fourth one that we see here is engage with others who are committed to digital accessibility and practicing it within their own organizations. And I think, Kate, you did mention this one about cooperating with other organizations that are doing similar things. And the last one here is aligning with third-party digital accessibility experts like Level Access, who can advise on legal requirements and standards that apply specifically to your organization and who can help create an internal process for prioritizing accessibility. So there you have it, 5 practical takeaways that you can take from today's session. If we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. On this one, you have our contact information on LinkedIn. So there you have it. Please reach out to us directly via LinkedIn. And at this point, I'd like to go to the next slide, please. And this is where we actually address some of the Q&As that were posted in the Q&A chat. Let me see if I can pick a couple of these ones here. There is one from David Jumeau, and it is around extended reality, virtual reality. And there is one that says, is there a link for XR, AR, VR mobile developers to reference to make their apps accessibility conformant? I'm thinking, John, maybe you want to address this one?
Yeah, this is a lot of good work that XR Access is doing around accessibility. There are some other user requirements that the W3C has put together, the user accessibility requirements for XR. We can share the link, but it's XR Access org would be a good reference site.
Thank you, John. Another one from David Jumeau as well, and this is an interesting one. He says, I am wondering what kinds of penalties for companies that fail to adhere to accessibility standards. How much? What is the most prominent? US, Canada, international, that you can share with us?
So this is John. I can try to jump in. It really depends on the state law, et cetera. So mostly with the ADA in the U.S., there's no punitive damages. So typically it's injunctive relief, it's attorney fees. There can be some compensatory damages. For example, I think with the Unruh Act, it's about $4,000 statutory damages, things like that. In Canada, with the Accessible Canada Act, there's also fines potentially that could be issued. Those fines can be in the range of $75,000 or more, depending on the incident and severity of the incident and so forth. In the US, the CVA, which is the Communication and Video Accessibility Act, you can be fined $100,000 per incident, per day. In theory, there can be fines. So it's not always just damages, but it can be fines. It really varies. I would say that it's not just the litigation costs though, or fines. It can be reputation. There's a lot of other costs. Sometimes if you have a settlement agreement, for example, with the Department of Justice, you may be in a certain timeline to meet that. And so you may have to put your other goals to the side so you can focus your team's effort on that. So there might be other lost revenue associated with it simply because you have to switch gears rather than being proactive.
Thank you, John. I'm going to ask a couple of other questions. There is one from, and again, they're legal, so this is what, again, to you, John. On the California bill, from Kevin Murphy, on the California bill 1757, which aims to make third-party developers accountable, do you know if it will apply to developers that are anywhere, or does the third party have to also be located in Canada? I mean, in California. Yeah. For example,
Right.
if a California business hires a company in Texas to develop that site, is the Texas company accountable, or do they get a pass because they are out of state?
Right. It would seem like that that they would be accountable because they're providing those services. Again, I'm not a lawyer, and there's more to be determined based on this law. But it would appear that the requirements aren't limited just to California businesses. It also does not clarify anything about internet-only businesses and how this would apply to internet-only businesses.
Thank you. One last question here. We have many. So this one is from Adrienne Duncan. And she says, my company does business in Canada. Are there any new regulations in the pipeline for that country or its provinces?
So there is a lot of provincial laws in Canada, Ontario with AODA, but there's other ones as well in Manitoba and British Columbia, and so these laws do apply to different situations. So it's something that we probably need to talk about offline, whether they do apply. But on Ontario, it would apply to private businesses with a certain number of employees, and so then you do have to meet requirements, and that is WCAG 2.0 A and AA. The federal requirements are for federally regulated businesses, which do include like banking and other transport services as well. So it just depends where your employees are and which province, and then if you're federally regulated or not.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all panelists for your participation and excellent answers. At this point, I'd like to invite Catherine to come on camera so she can wrap us up. And Catherine, would you mind joining?
I'm happy to. If we could go to the next slide.
Thank you.
So I just want to thank you to all of our presenters, Kate, John, Chas, Guatam, and a special thank you to Eduardo, who serves as our DC Metro Chief Accessibility Officer, for leading the annual accessibility for 8 straight years. Thank you so much, Shannon and the accessibility team, and thank you, Aiello. TCS Interpreting, Martha and Tabitha. As a reminder, the session was recorded and we will send out a link to the recording, but once it's been made accessible. Thank you also to all of our attendees and your great conversation and questions. Please sign up at our website for our newsletter and our Disability Professional Development Center. We have an amazing organization and would love to have you included. Our next events focus on disabled-owned businesses and diversity suppliers and a veteran event in November. Please join us. Thank you again. Thank you, Level Access. Thank you all for joining us.